before the coffee break, we heard all about the challenges that relate to cumulative effects assessments, of which there are many. So now we're going to move into the next session where we're going to hear from researchers across the ECOWind and OWEC projects on cumulative effects assessment models, frameworks, and comparisons, followed by the variety of outputs that can come from that range of approaches, including ecosystem services, natural capital value, and understanding concepts like marine net gain. So I'd like to invite to the stage Beth Scott, Professor of Marine Ecology at the University of Aberdeen, and Martin Solon, Professor of Marine Ecology at University of Southampton. Thank you both.
Okay, thank you. So I've been asked to talk about cumulative effect assessments across the projects of ECOWind and OWEC. And this was a really interesting process. Really had some fun meeting everybody else across the projects. Had a lot of talk, but of course with academics, the first thing we've got to do is define what it is we're talking about. So there was a lot of interesting things going on. But we've, of course, then said cumulative effects is the effects across multiple developments. But there wasn't a whole lot of agreement about which effects we should actually be focusing on. So what I'm going to do in this talk is I'm going to cover a lot of considerations from the academics' point of view about cumulative effects, but we're going to look at it in the context of the current cumulative effect assessments. And so I'm going to do this in about 7 minutes, and then we're going to have 3 minutes of each project coming up and giving their talks and showing examples of their methods. And then I'm going to do a summary, and then I'm going to pass over to Martin, who is going to do the same for the outcomes that we're getting out of the models that we're talking about. So what I want to start with then is this picture that our Dutch colleagues produced some years ago now, because it's a complex picture, but it's not that complex. And what I've got highlighted in orange here are basically what we've been talking about most of the time, is that we look at cumulative effects and conservation issues about birds, mammals, and benthos. And that's what we mean when we say offshore wind. And what we want to talk about is the fact that all of these other things matter. Climate, all of the things that offshore wind are doing under the water, to the seabed, and also up through the trophic change, through plankton, into affecting things like fish and fisheries. So I'm expecting to see a lot of developers go, come on, guys, it's already complicated enough, right? Please, 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 don't do any more. But just bear with me, if you could bear with me, because what we're saying is what the things we're looking at in our projects, they, at 50 gigawatts, in fact, at 25 gigawatts, they are going to be significant. These top-down and bottom-up effects are going to be significant. So what I'm putting up here is some examples of that. The physics is going to change things. The amount of mixing underwater, which we've known about for a while, but we haven't been too worried about until we've come out into deeper water. There's going to be a lot more plankton or a lot less plankton, we're not sure yet. But also it turns out the extraction of the wind energy itself, taking that wind energy out so it doesn't go on and mix the water column, actually has a massive effect. We've known for a long time about sediments. You know, we've really got to do a look at that more. We've got a bunch of projects, and if I can get the video going for the purple one. There we go. We've also known for a long time, this is work from Debbie Russell from many years ago, tagging seals and finding seals going completely changing their behavior to what they used to do before and starting to target just the pylons. Well, what that means, of course, is the fish must have changed their behavior. The fish are much easier to catch. Why else would an animal change its behavior? That change in fish behavior has got to be dealt with. We have to figure that out because, of course, we've also got the fact that that fishing will change. And the displacement of fishing is going to do a lot of things to the ecosystem as well as the social economic aspects of it. We have to take these things into account. Okay, so why are we in the situation we're in now where those things haven't been taken into account? And what I would say is, here's another OSPAR example, is that we collect the data separately. Essentially, of course, seabird experts collect seabird data, mammal experts collect mammal data, fish experts collect fish data, right? And habitat people collect that, but it's all done separately And it's done without collecting the physics at the same time for the vast majority of the time. So what I would say is the simple issue is, what about the linkages and the relationships between all these trophic layers? We haven't been collecting the data in the right way to do this simply. We have a lot of data, we can do it, but not simply. Also, as you've heard then from a lot of talks, and what came up with a lot of the discussions we had across our projects, is we realized, a lot of the modelers who are down doing their work really hard actually weren't quite aware of how these things were put together. How did we decide where the footprints of the wind farms are that we've got already? And this idea of, we've heard about all these different layers that we put together, we look at the pressures, and there's actually published papers on it, and I know it's evolved, this Mars system, it's evolved, it's better, and we heard from Tristan this morning, these things are getting better and better, but again, there is nothing about the linkages or the relationship between all those layers. Those layers interact with each other, and it's not additive, and it may not be multiplicative, we don't know. So what we've done also is that we then think, what we're trying to do is we are trying to speed things up. The certainty we have in the room around all the academics is climate change is real. It's coming on so fast. It's the worst enemy. We've got to speed this up. We want to get there. The vision that was asked about this morning, we want to get there as fast as we possibly can. We think actually going back and looking at whole ecosystem cumulative effects is going to help you speed it up. And so what we did is we went and we looked at what I've got here now is numbered as 7, of what developers actually should be doing when they consent, when you look at the national guidelines. And so what I'm going to just rapidly do is show where our ECOWind areas are covering into what we should be doing. So ECOWind Area 1 is talking about looking at observations between interspecies relationships and the effects of those on populations dynamics. So that's going to cover the first 3 about the existing environmental stuff, but this idea that the baseline is dynamic, it's going to change, and getting in uncertainty, which we all agree we need to do. And then, is it there? Area 2, this idea, we're going to do it with new instrumentation. We also, as an industry, as a group, need to decarbonize, and we want to have much lower carbon when we go out and do all our work. We don't have to do it all with lots of boats and stuff. And so we can put out all these instruments now, and we can collect all kinds of things simultaneously across trophic levels, so we can deal with direct and indirect effects and all these temporal aspects that come out in these other things, and things about frequencies of impacts. And for our third, area 3, that's where we're going to talk today about these cumulative effects, where we're putting all these together so that we are coming out, we are building these very complicated models, I agree, but we're doing that, we're running them, and those answers will be available within 12, 24 months from now, with some interim and then some final. And what we're doing there is we're really can then start looking at a really comprehensive worst case scenario, especially with climate, but also this idea of carrying capacity of the environment. So what's going to happen next is we're now going to have call to the stage people to come up quite rapidly and go through 3 minutes each of their projects. So can I first call up Kate Searley, please? There you go. And then I'll come back at the end and summarize.
Hi, thank you, Beth. So I am here on behalf of Prepared. Prepared is a project which fundamentally is about understanding the responses of prey and their predators to the impacts of offshore wind. The predators that we're talking about within Prepared are both seabirds and marine mammals. So the way that we have set up our research within the project is to try and make sure that the research that we develop and deliver can influence both short-term, medium-term, and the long-term future of how we do cumulative impacts assessments of offshore wind for seabirds and marine mammals. So in the short term, it's really about working with the current situation. We've heard a lot about now, the importance of now. So we have legal frameworks, we have guidance. So how can we do research that feeds into that directly, that can sort of start to make a difference right now? So within prepared, that involves things to do with novel data collection and products. It's about improving uncertainty around some of the key parameters that are used within models. And it's about developing those models. So a nice example that's just been finished up in prepared is that SMRU have led on has been around collecting information and quantifying the energetic value of a whole range of different fish species so that we can understand what those energetics, the energy content of those species means to predators in terms of their diets. And that feeds directly into current methods, current models that are used today in assessments in terms of reducing some of that uncertainty in some of our dynamic energy budget models and the way that we estimate impacts of changes in behavior. So then in terms of the medium term, this is more about recognizing that we have guidance, we have a legal framework, but can we develop the way that that guidance is used through enhancing models? So can we sort of replace some of the maybe more simplistic approaches that are currently used with more realistic models as that evidence accumulates? So within prepared, that's really a big focus on this inclusion of predator-prey dynamics. So it's about understanding why are the fish responding to wind farms in the way that they are, and then why are the predators responding to those wind farms? Are predators responding primarily to redistribution of their prey, or are there other aspects to the disturbance from wind farms that also affects those changes? So we're looking at that within prepared, we're collecting a lot of data on that, and then we're looking at where that evidence allows us to change our modeling approaches that currently sit within the assessment framework to allow that to happen. And then in terms of the sort of longer term future, it's really about developing research that actually allows us to shape that regulatory process, to shape those legal frameworks, and presenting that sort of best scientific evidence. So one of the things we're currently looking at within prepared is the effect of the recent marine heat wave on fish and seabirds and predators. So the evidence that we're collecting there and the understanding that we're gaining on how that marine heat wave affected those different trophic levels, but also the interactions of those trophic levels, how can we then present that to regulators and policymakers so that they can see how they can shape legal frameworks in the regulatory process to be more agile, because we know these marine heat wave events are going to continue. So just focusing very briefly a little bit more on the ornithological constraints. So across the top of this slide, you have a summary of the current way that habitat regulations work. And essentially, the key component of this within prepared is about trying to provide evidence about whether projects alone and in combination with each other result in likely significant effects. So for seabirds, that's really understanding why are birds where they are and what are they doing? How does that affect their exposure to collision, displacement, and barrier risks? And then how does that translate into population level impacts? So within prepared and also within some of the ECOWind projects, but particularly ECOWINGs, that's really about improving this estimation of the spatial distributions of birds in relation to their prey and how those are affected by offshore wind farms. It's about improving the way that we scale up these effects. We've talked a lot about not wanting to just estimate effects in isolation and add them together. So prepared is working to develop new understanding and new models to do that in a much more realistic way. And then finally, it's about reducing uncertainty, particularly at the population level, by including things like the shifting baseline and the way that we look at population trends and impacts. So just my final slide is just to sort of show you some of the very recent data that's come out just this year. This was collected by Marine Scotland Science. So essentially, it's simultaneous data collection of sand eels, kittiwakes that can be overlaid on top of each other and interrogated to really understand why are these different species of seabirds in the places that they are, how are they responding to prey, and how is that affected by wind farms? And that's my last slide. Who's next?
All right, thank you. For Accelerate, how can we help with the whole question about cumulative effects? And I think to answer that, we have to go back to the rationale behind the Accelerate project. And that's kind of very nicely presented here in this infographic. Basically, what we try to do is we try to trace the cascade of effects caused by a change in the physical environment as a result of sea level rise, climate change in general, and the installation of offshore wind farms. So the change in physical environment that we are focusing on is the change in the bed shear stress. So we are very much focused on the benthic environment to start off with. And that will cause, in some places, erosion, winnowing, scour, but in other places, deposition. And so that will then have a knock-on in the distribution of substrata, which then influences the benthic habitats and therefore biodiversity and ecosystems delivered by that benthic habitat. It also has a knock-on on the spatial distribution of key prey fish species, such as sand eels, which then again influences the distribution of seabird populations. And we will try to answer those three questions, and at the end also try to provide a robust upscaling, because as academics, we love to work in case studies with the most fantastic data sets and measurements and whatever, but the reality of the matter is in many places we don't have that information. So we try to also quantify about how much information do we lose at each upscaling step. Overall, this is kind of a framework, an approach, which we will develop and we will demonstrate, but it's also quite modular and it can be adapted. So the effect of other developments in the marine environment can be slotted in at several levels. And I will just talk you through that in the sense of how are we going to try to answer those questions and at what locations or what scales are we going to work. So in terms of the climate impact, for that, we're looking at UK shelf-wide modeling using the NEMO model and incorporating the effect of sea level rise, change in waves, tides, and storminess. And we're predicting for 2050 and 2100. And so predicting what that is going to do to the shear stress and the bed mobility. At the complete other end of the spectrum, we're also looking at individual turbines, doing flume tests with different types of monopiles, different type of bed armoring, and seeing what the wake of those turbines is going to do to the seabed. And those two sets of information will then be compiled into our sediment dynamic modeling, the Telemac model we will use for that. It's a model that has a variable grid size, so we can focus in more detail at areas where we think there's a high chance for change, and keep it a bit wider in areas where we expect less change. And so from that, we expect, or we will predict currents, bed evolution, shear stress, composition. And it's at that level where we can already start slotting in other effects. If there is a cable, if there is a pipeline, if there's a tidal turbine planned in the area, that can be included in the Telemac model, and the effects of that can be included. That output then goes into our second level, habitat suitability modeling, what's happening with the benthic habitats under all these scenarios of change. We will use machine learning techniques for that, but we will also feed in real observations to train and calibrate the models. And we are carrying out some of that observational work ourselves using the newest technologies, including AUVs that we have deployed within well-established existing wind farms, so we can calibrate our models for what is going to happen not just 1 year after the wind farm is there, but actually decades after. From that habitat suitability, or from that habitat distribution map, we will also derive ecosystem services, and we will try to include ecosystem services delivered by the communities on the infrastructure as well. That brings me to the next level. Sorry, I also wanted to include with the habitat distribution, at that level, we can bring in things like other explanatory variables that explain where the habitats are distributed, things like fishing impact and so on. The next level, we then will look at species distribution models for the birds, so at the UK level, and also seabed state space models, so where we quantify the energy usage to forage and the energy gained to forage, and how that's going to change under climate change and offshore wind farms. And again, we are carrying out observations in situ to calibrate those models. And finally, our upscaling, we will lean on the generalized ocean turbulence model and an enhanced Kalman filtering digital twinning to look at how reduction in quality of input data propagates error through that whole sequence of simulations. To the next one.
Hello everyone, I'm Neda and I'll be introducing to you Bellagio project. So you recognize on the left-hand side the 3 areas from the ECOWind program or objectives, and I just wanted to start off with how Bellagio is spanning across these 3 areas. So first off, the first package is very much focusing on the bottom-up effects. So really trying to understand the physical effects from offshore wind farm development, but also in the context of climate change on some key physical processes, but also primary production. And we're looking very much that across 3 different spatial scales, so local, regional, and shelf-wide. And then that feeds into the second work package, is really very much looking prey to predator. So we're really focusing on this key forage fish availability and how they provide foraging opportunities for top predators such as seabirds and mammals. And finally, this all comes together into the third work package, which is very much looking the ecosystem cumulative effects and really bringing on trying to understand population trends and how they obviously, again, how they change in response to offshore wind farms, climate change, and fisheries, and really bring that information together to be able to inform marine policy and measurement solutions and potentially develop some tools that are informative and can provide evidence. So just moving on a little bit on the outputs, again, just following the same framework of the different packages and what's going to be available. So the first 2 packages, again, very much about testing new innovative kit, but also different types of modeling as well. So from the first package, we have autonomous monitoring techniques such as gliders and moorings, but also in combination with oceanographic modeling that really will provide understanding on the fine and far field effects of offshore wind, but also climate change as well. In the second work package, we're testing fish acoustic platforms, and again, a range of different modeling approaches as well. We call this, what will be available in the second work package is this new fish availability metric that will really hopefully provide a lot more understanding for the reason for the spatial and temporal distribution of top predators. But also, so not just only survey techniques and acoustics will be for the second work package, but also a lot of long-term tagging data as well. And then how does that, again, just fits into the the third package where we're talking about cumulative effects in ecosystems. So that's the one package I'm heavily involved in. And what we're doing here is the development of an ecosystem, very much data-driven Bayesian network ecosystem model, which allows us to look at trends of population trends over space and over time. So really allowing for that dynamic components and dynamic interactions across the physics, but also a range of the biology as well, and how does that change. And we're running a range of scenarios which are framed around obviously offshore wind farms, climate change, but also fishery displacement, and what are potentially the effects of that as well. And what else we're doing in the third package is we have this modified habitat risk assessment framework. So we have a lot of strong collaborations with the Natural Capital Project and Stanford University, where they have developed this INVEST model. So INVEST stands for the Integrated Valuation of Ecosystem Services and Trade-offs. And it's very good in terms that it can actually provide the levels of risk, sort of risk-benefit maps. And we can use the dynamic outputs from the dynamic Bayesian network ecosystem model in combination with this habitat risk assessment framework and INLO to some extent to really understand what are the benefits and the trade-offs in a space use. And finally, just to finish up on that, hopefully improve understanding on the traditional 3Ds, but potentially hopefully move away from the 3Ds and, as we call them, provide more data and evidence on the 3 new Cs. So that is cumulative effects, climate change, and hopefully new information and evidence for compensation measures as well. That's me.
I'd just like to talk through some of the work of the BOWE project. So I would say all 4 work packages have to deal with cumulative effects. The work package 1 is all about collating existing spatial data, but producing new derived products from that. Work package 2, probably doing the most important work, which is laboratory observations of 8 species and their response to cumulative effects. So actually trying to quantify the cumulative effects. So this is providing like the raw data that we use to pull up through these models. So work here, for example, here on Nephrops scampi, looking at behavioral change, which is burrowing activity, using different sound treatments. So we're going to be doing more of this kind of work, both using electromagnetic and noise, but in combination with other treatments such as climate change treatments, temperature, etc. So work package, as I've said, work package 1 is about spatial data, work package 2 is providing the raw data, work package 3 is trying to basically assimilate all this information and scale it up. So the first step is to use structural equation modeling, which is going to take the laboratory work and build that into a more cohesive ecological unit that we can pull into a more broader model, which is going to be a Bayesian belief network. And the idea is that within the Bayesian belief model, we can incorporate it with other biological components and other anthropogenic activities to produce a more sort of holistic understanding of cumulative effects. So the choice for Bayesian belief networks is a fairly obvious one. It's a very flexible approach. It's able to use lots of different types of information. It can be spatial data, it can be quantitative data sets, it can even be expert judgment, because without doubt, when we're looking at all these possible interactions, there's going to be lots that we won't have evidence for, and we need to try and plug those gaps, potentially with expert judgment, labeled as being highly uncertain, of course. Ultimately, we are combining the benthic module, but we are also going to have additional modules to cover both seabirds, marine mammals, and water column processes. So we're primarily going to merge the benthic work, but we're going to have these additional modules that we can populate potentially with information from other projects and other sources. Something just about the sort of configuration of the Bayesian belief model. Spatial resolution is going to pull in a lot of GIS information, and that ultimately sets the sort of spatial footprint, the extent and the resolution of the model outputs. What we use, whether it's turbine level, farm level, regional level, it's very flexible. It can basically take any type of information. Temporal resolution, they are static models. So unlike a lot of these mechanistic physical models that we've seen that produce time series, these are going to be static, but they will consider the different construction phases of construction, operational, decommissioning phases. And I think without doubt the challenges for work package 3, which ultimately will hand over information to work package 4, that's all about natural capital assessments and decision support tools. But definitely the challenges are to really to aggregate and build upon some of the existing cumulative effects frameworks that we saw this morning, not to reinvent the wheel, but to build upon some of these existing frameworks. And I think that's probably where I shall leave it. Thank you.
Yeah, good morning. So I'm Mike Heath from the University of Strathclyde, here representing the ECOWind project. So I'm not going to try and give an overview of the project because there's a lot of work on seabirds and cumulative effects in that respect, but I'm going to give you some thoughts on the more strategic and synthetic aspects of the project, about how we answer the question, what's the ecosystem carrying capacity for offshore wind at the scale of the whole North Sea? So clearly there's a physical limit. There's a fixed amount of space. How many can we cram into that space? Well, you can calculate that on the back of an envelope, but how many would be ecologically sustainable? That's the question I want to try and get you to think about today. So on the top left here, we've heard a lot these last couple of days about the individual direct effects that turbines have on life in the sea and physics in the sea. So there's collision risk, which lead to mortality. There's changes in behavior patterns and aggregations of prey, which lead to changes in the feeding efficiency of seals. There's some great examples of tagging of seals staying in wind farms. There are changes in the seabed, the rock armoring that goes around the basis of the pylons, changes the whole biogeochemistry of the seabed in that area. There's a sediment resuspension, there's vertical mixing of the water column, displacement of fisheries. Lots of work going on that across all the projects. But the next stage is to ask the question, how do those scale up as we increase the number of turbines? So in the middle top, we've got, let's take its mortality of seabirds. At the North Sea scale, no turbines, no additional mortality. As we increase the number of turbines, we'll see a small increase in mortality, and then perhaps at some point there'll be a rapid increase and reach some saturation level. And around that, there's a lot of uncertainty, not just because we don't understand the processes, but because it depends on where you put the turbines, how you space them, how you arrange them relative to each other. So that's the next step. For each of these individual direct effects, we need that picture which says, how does that effect scale up to the scale of the North Sea as we increase turbines? Then we have this mechanistic process-based ecosystem model called STRATH-E2E, into which we can build these scaling relationships in the middle diagram. That's a whole ecosystem model. It goes from physics and chemistry and sediments right up to whales. And we can put these relationships inside it. If you want to know more about the model, the QR code don't work very well on a phone. It works best on a tablet. Well, this link at the bottom, and you can use it yourself. So the output from that model, we then need to distill that to get some modeled ecosystem health indicators, which we derive from that output. And there's a number of EU projects we're involved in, very actively involved in doing that sort of distillation. And it's feeding also into some OSPA ecosystem status assessments in cooperation with CFAS. And then the middle, bottom right, this is the key one I want you to think about. So if we think about a baseline, that might be the 2010s, very few wind farms. As we increase the number of turbines, how do these GES indicator status indicators change as we increase the number of turbines in the North Sea? Well, this is how we imagine it would change. There'll be a slow, not much change initially, then a steep drop in ecosystem status, and then some flattening out at the bottom. And then I've got this line on here, which is the minimum acceptable level. And that's almost a political decision, if you like. That's the level below which we don't want the ecosystem to fall. And the gap between the baseline and that level is what we can think of some sort of headroom, the space in which we've got to build wind farms without harming the ecological status. And the white dotted lines onto the lower axis, that tells you what the carrying capacity is of that ecosystem for turbines. But then the interesting question is, what happens to that baseline as human activities like fishing change and climate changes? That baseline is going to move up and down, changing your headroom for turbines, and the carrying capacity will move sideways on the x-axis in response. And that's the next thing we have to think about. Just thinking into the future. What is the carrying capacity? How sensitive is that in an ecological sense to these other effects? And finally, just to say that this is just an ecological measure of the carrying capacity for turbines. There are other currencies that you can think of that you might use to measure that capacity, and those are economic and social, but I'm not going to talk about that here today. Thank you.
Okay, so you saw a huge amount of information in a very short period of time. So what I'm going to do, just another minute or two, is just to summarize what you've seen. I put back up the 7 things that developers are supposed to be doing, and I'm going to start then the very summary I have, and also so you can see all the similarities and how we can also look across and look at synergies across these projects. So prepared, we're saying it's a cumulative effects framework that they've got there, looking at one species at a time, although they are looking at predator-prey interactions. And so at the moment, that one is suited to the regulation 1 to 3. Accelerate, focusing on the benthos and the sediment. It links these changes from the bed stress and mixing through the changes in biodiversity. It actually includes an energetic state base to it that looks at benthic organisms and seabird species. And there's air propagation through the whole way. And they'll be looking at climate change 8.5. And I'm giving them then ticks 1 to 6. Pelagio, focusing on the pelagic environment. The biophysical changes are leading to pattern-driven. This is using our pattern-driven Bayesian model, quite different from the other ones. It's a whole system dynamic predictions then. And then we have confidence levels for all the population trends, and we can look at each trophic level, and we can look at displacement of fisheries and the same climate change projections. So again, I'm ticking us 1 to 6. Bowie, again, another benthic fossa, but quite differently, looking at these GIS overlaps. The seabird mammal work coming in from Poseidon, as I understand, also looking at fishing displacement. And as James said, this Bayesian belief network approach, quite different to the other one, and trying to determine, though, the interactions with gilts, again, looking at climate change, again, getting ticked 1 to 6. And finally, ECOWINGs, very process-based, mechanistic ecosystem model, okay? Quite different, predicting these biophysical changes through these multiple linked population models. But also, as Mike just said, this calculating of GES and carrying capacity, super important, along with climate change. They tick all the boxes 1 to 7. So just before I hand over to Martin, what we learned as well is that there's this new law coming in, a new act, Leveling Up and Regeneration Act, that actually affects us a lot because it's going to ask us to do environmental outcome reports. We're interpreting that as possible. This is the way to get to GES and ecosystem services easily. We're hoping so. And if that is the case now, I'm going to hand over to Martin to talk about cumulative effect outputs that all the projects are going to do.
Thanks, Martin. Thank you both, and good morning. Yesterday, Dickon joked that Colin has a reputation for speaking, and I thought, well, maybe that's a bit unfair. So this morning, while Colin was talking, I checked in with the national grid. And whilst Colin was talking, the carbon intensity of the UK grid went from 91 to 85 grams of carbon per kilowatt hour. So Dickon's joke was actually correct. But it was what Colin said that was important. He reminded us about the problems, the magnitude of the problems we face, the urgency of those problems. And Zoe reminded us that in 7 years' time, things are going in the water. As Beth said, on the science side here and the evidence that we're going to gather within this program, we have that same urgency. And yet we've got 2 to 3 years to deliver some of the evidence that you need. So the good news, though, is that we're not starting from the beginning. There's lots of data, lots of processes, lots of ecological theory that we can put to these questions that we face. The problem, though, is there's an issue with the narrative. So this is one of the kind of textbook ways we might summarize a system, and we might think of it in terms of having a number of natural capital assets, whether it's habitat, biodiversity, climate, whatever we want. And then there's this kind of linear relationship that is depicted where all those assets provide us with services that we care about, energy, food, direct use of sediment, for example, carbon sequestration. And the reason we care about those is because ultimately they give benefits to society. And then there's another narrative that sits alongside that is there's various things that we can do. We can manage or restore, we can extract or modify, we can change how we produce things or we process things and balance those risks and opportunities in the system. So those interventions have the potential to modify. What we're really asking is, can we have our cake and eat it at the same time? So we've kind of got these various locations where we might want to do that. The problem we have with that is that we're asking, as we've seen in many, many diagrams throughout this conference, is we're asking quite often bivariate questions in a multivariate space. And what we need is this robust and ambiguous evidence, because one of the things we keep saying in this room is it depends on location, it depends on the phase of offshore development, it depends on climate change, it depends on other human activities. And it's easy to forget there's lots of other things going on in that space. So context and timing matter. And that's what we, as Beth said as well, that's what we as a program are focusing on, and that's what we're going to try and deliver. So we can start thinking about the system, and we can break that down into lots of bivariate questions. So how does X affect Y? It's that balance between those risks and those opportunities. But what we need to do, and what we are doing, is taking that whole space and putting it together. We're taking that holistic view. So yes, some habitats in the top right, that's maybe what the bottom of the sea looks like at the start. but then we're introducing these vertical, through the piles and so on, these vertical systems that are very different. Not only are they different in biodiversity and biomass, they're also different in what they do to the whole system in terms of its trophic level. So we can ask things like, how does sound affect a particular species, or how does vibration affect a particular species? But what we should be asking is, how does that affect those species in that system, and the things we care about, the functioning of that system as a whole, when we take into account all of those things, plus location, plus wind phase, plus climate change, plus those other human activities. So it's all really about, how do we leave this environment in a better state? And in the program, across the program, we're recognizing that not only is there an issue with the narrative, the way that consenting is done has its problems, and we've recognized some of those problems, and of course we're working on those problems. That is a dynamic space as well. But the science community doesn't like the way that process takes place, and there's so much uncertainty in the system that it slows the consenting down. We heard about, every gigawatt of delay is what was it, 1 million tons of CO2 into the environment. So again, this emphasis to move faster. So how can we be helpful? Well, across the programs, we're looking for trends and patterns, and how external modifiers, not just wind, but everything else in that space, change the system. Okay, understanding how the system works. We're looking for mechanistic understanding in the field through experiments. We're looking at site-specific features and interventions. What does it really look like? When we talk about electromagnetism, what is a cable doing? How is it protected? Is it sheathed? Is it unsheathed? Is it DC? Is it AC? Has it got a concrete mattress over the top of it? All of those things, how does that interact with the environment? And then we're looking at single versus those multiple systems. So not only are those factors compounded by multiple things going on in the system, but they're also compounding as we scale from a single pylon right the way up through to the farm scale, and then into multiple farm scales. And in order to reduce certainty across the board, we're all using, across all of the projects, we're all using multiple techniques. So there's an ensemble of both causal, probabilistic modeling, we've got statistical modeling, we've got other techniques. And when they all should point in the same direction, and that reduces our uncertainty, it increases our certainty in that our conclusions are correct. And then, of course, we also, across the program, in terms of the predictions themselves, we're looking at the error around those, so we can produce let's call it a standard error around those things. So as in the previous talk, just as by way of a couple of examples, there's many more, but there's a couple of examples. We're going to hear from Francis first, then Vera, Neda, and Gaetano. So Francis, if you want to come up, and then I'll return just at the end just to sum up.
Thank you, Martin. I want to talk a bit about ECOWINDs and focus we have on marine net gain. We've heard a lot about that over the last couple of days, and we're all at quite an early stage in that, and there's a lot of common ground, I think, about where we are, both from the researchers' side and from regulators and other stakeholders. So it's a good moment, I think, for us to try to progress this area, as you yourselves in the policy side are trying to pull together new policies. And of course, we're in a situation where these policies are much less developed than, for example, cumulative impact assessment policies. So a lot of interest in this area right the way through the last couple of days, but it was also came through very strongly when ECOWind was devised, that this is something that the wider community wanted us to focus on. And one way that we can look at this conceptually is this diagram shown here, where we might have a species metric or an ecosystem metric that has shown some historical decline over the last few decades, which, as we've seen in many of our aspects of the ecosystems in UK waters. And under climate change, which is considered to be one of the main causes for these declines, set to continue, we see this further decline predicted under climate change. And that's the yellow projection part of the right-hand side of the graph. And that's something that has been called a few times at this meeting a shifting baseline, and it's a useful expression that we need to keep in mind in this context. If we then have a further negative impact of offshore wind farms on aspects of our ecosystem, and that's not to say or to assume that all effects will be negative, but there are some concerns that aspects will be detrimentally affected by, as we roll out these wind farms, then that's that further decline over and above climate change, shown here in the red projection. So what are we going to do about the twin effects of climate change and impacts of offshore wind? And how can we achieve net gain? And of course, and what that's shown here is in the blue graph. And a key question there is, are we returning to our baseline, which is our shifting baseline, a sort of no net loss of offshore wind? I think that's not where we are. Everything we hear is about going beyond that into net gain. And that's that blue projection. And of course, the question then is how far, where are we trying to get to? What is the former baseline that we're trying to achieve? Is it the halcyon days of the 1980s when top predators were hoovering up abundant sand eels, or is that an unrealistic aspiration? And we need help with this. We, as ecologists, can investigate different forms of recovery, but we need to understand where the benchmark really lies. And in terms of some of the more detail, and this is not an exhaustive list of the things that we need to consider in the context of marine net gain, but again, there's a lot of common ground. Some of the talks this morning, particularly by Ian, actually covered a lot of the same topics, and that's encouraging. We're thinking about some of the same questions. We need to understand the methods that are being considered in terms of net gain. Is it about passive restoration, the removal of pressures? Is it about active creation? Is it about unplanned net gain that may occur as a result of, for example, a development that wasn't in the initial plan but may arise? So we need to understand which of those we need to be investigating. And then there's the shifting baseline and the net gain that is robust to climate change. I think we all agree that that needs to be factored in. And then there are these two strands. A lot of the talk about net gain is considered in ecosystem terms, but there has been such an emphasis in assessments and in impacts of offshore wind on individual species, protected species. And that's this diagram on the right. We have these two strands. We have the strong emphasis on species and then these ecosystem health measures that we're also thinking about. So how do we consider net gain at those two dimensions? Then there's the whole question of metrics. There's different people working on this. Again, it's helpful for us to talk to you, and maybe we can discuss this afternoon, about what metrics you want us to look at, that you will be looking to measure as a form of effective improvements. And there's challenges associated with terminology. We talk about biodiversity, we talk about natural capital, we talk about ecosystem services, and what do we mean by those? And I think there's probably a knowledge exchange there to help you shape what we do with this area. But ultimately, it needs to be measures that we can monitor effectively. I think like a lot of these things, we need to have some ways in which we can measure effectiveness to establish how well we're doing. So in ECOWind, for example, we're doing a series of linked models that incorporate hydrodynamic and climate projections that feed into zooplankton models. These then feed into fish models and then ultimately seabird population models. That's shown in this diagram at the bottom here. And then we have another route that goes from those climate projections into the Strath-E2E model that you heard from Mike earlier. So these sorts of models allow us to investigate net gain under different ways in which you think would be useful for us to do so. And I'm sure that's true for other projects in OWEC and ECOWind as well. But we also need to understand better, because we need to understand better the policy landscape that you're all working with. We've got the whole question of compensatory measures and the idea of pushing them a little further and going beyond no net loss. That's an obvious example of net gain. But we're acutely aware that you are thinking much more broadly than that. You're thinking about other policies of net gain, marine enhancement, but you're also grappling with other policies, for example, on fisheries management, and what is the interplay between them, and therefore what are the options that one particular policy area may focus on one thing that actually constrains what's available for other policy areas, and in particular, where are you going with marine net gain? So I think we're looking forward to talking to all of you today and beyond today to make sure the work that we do on marine net gain is actually going to be useful to you, because there's lots of different ways that we can take it. And I think some shaping from your side to ensure that we're well aligned is where we'd like to be. Thank you very much.
Right. For Accelerate, as I realized, I took more than my 3 minutes in the previous slide, so I'll be quick here. Our thinking is also still evolving, and we would be very happy to take in suggestions and questions. But what we currently have on the table and in the proposal or project plan is that, as I mentioned before, we will be doing habitat predictions under all the scenarios that we're also modeling the seabed stress changes. And so for all of those scenarios, we will also quantify the ecosystem services delivered by the different habitat distribution mosaics that come out of our model frameworks. For that, we will rely on the asset service matrices as they are currently being developed by JNCC. And we will also feed into that process, because we will assess what are the ecosystem services that are provided by the communities that grow on the infrastructure, as that is currently still lacking in the JNCC framework. So our aim is to try to come up with an overall loss gain estimate for the different scenarios of offshore wind farms and climate change that we are modeling. On the larger scale of the UK shelf, with the seabird work, as I mentioned, we also do species distribution models and these state space models that look at the energy usage. And based on that, we will also suggest adapted sensitivity indices. So starting from existing RSPB indices, for example, adapting them to include a quantification of how specific the habitat is, how heterogeneous the habitat patchwork is, how much chance there is that that's going to change under climate change, under development of all the human activities in the sea. So that's where we're at with specific outputs for the moment. And then coming back to what I mentioned before, our approach to in Accelerate is modular, so we can take in other effects in our modeling framework, as I mentioned before, and also in terms of quantification of uncertainty, as I mentioned briefly earlier on. We have this digital twinning planned, where we look at how the degradation of information as we move away from actual measurements affects or confidence in our predictions throughout the whole modeling framework that we've set up. That part of the work will result in an online tool that you will be able to use in the different areas where you're developing your next offshore wind farm plans. So that's basically what we can feed into this process at the moment.
Okay, so in Pelagio, similarly to the other projects, we're also again bringing in on techniques about ecosystem services valuation and natural capital accounting. And we're considering a range of natural capital assets and stocks that are shown in the table, and so is their equivalent ecosystem services. But the one that I really wanted to focus on, particularly the next slide, will be the fisheries catch and landings and their ecosystem services in terms of providing food supply. So again, very similarly to throughout the whole work that we're conducting in Pelagio, the ecosystem services changes will be assessed at a range of spatial scale, so that is local, regional, and shelf-wide. under a range of offshore wind farm deployment scenarios and from alternative fisheries displacement and climate change scenario. And then again, to be really, again, to be able to bring in this all together, thinking about cumulative and marine net gain, what will be available at the end is this risk-benefit maps where you can really assess the cumulative risk to ecosystem services and what are the potential trade-offs in a space use. Okay, so just focusing a little bit more on the fisheries catch and landing examples. So what we've done previously, we have designed an interdisciplinary framework that's really capturing the changes or the evidence-based links from any changes in the biophysical environment and then translating that to natural capital, ecosystem services, but also socioeconomic impact as well. And we've worked very closely with the fishing industry, but so as developers and other statutory groups to develop the scenarios that will be used in the dynamic Bayesian network ecosystem model. So obviously, to begin with, very much a case study will be the area within the Firth of Forth, and the scenarios that I mentioned earlier are again more like looking at the changes of the effects of with or without wind farms, fishing displacement, and climate change. But again, focusing on with the Firth of Forth, but that will be translated across multiple other spatial scales as well. And the outputs that will be available is not only changes to populations, so fish biomass abundance or recruitment, but also very much looking at changes to financial outcomes, so gross value added, whether gross value added is increased or lost. And just a little bit on the scenarios that specifically we're doing with the fishing displacement issue. So we've had a workshop with the fishing industry, and we really wanted to sense check what goes into the model and whether we can really incorporate those challenges that the industry is facing. So some of the scenarios are considering, obviously, changes in terms of what gears are allowed, but also the amount of space that's available to the fishing industry. And again, oops. So this is just an illustration to show you how is everything coming together and what the outputs will be available so that really we can talk about cumulative changes and net gain as well. And the fishing and the natural mortality is just one example when we're looking at changes to a pelagic or demersal fish species and really be able to assess not just the negative, but also the positive changes and how that might affect other trophic levels as well. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Hello, everyone. In BOWE, this is work package 4. So we are really trying to do two things. The first one is linking all the environmental outputs and values from work packages 1, 2, and 3 to socioeconomic values and outputs and outcome. And the second thing is to find a way to how to best use and present and make all this evidence accessible to policymakers. So about linking, the first step was to draft or develop a generic natural capital and ecosystem services framework. What we did was mapping the impact, the main seabed impact from offshore wind on some of the main ecosystem services that we identified. And in this way, we were able to understand what are potentially the changes in ecosystem services provision. And of course, once we understand the change, we can make the link with socioeconomic values and socioeconomic changes, including, but not limited to, of course, monetary valuation, but also other socioeconomic and societal values more widely. We can then use all this information into a policy appraisal with a lot of other consideration, for example, about collocation or policy priorities and so on. But of course, what we learn, I would say very well, is that many of the other projects are taking this approach, are doing these outputs in terms of ecosystem services provision, but we need a lot of more of evidence. We have a lot of more of evidence available. So how to make all this evidence more integrated, more accessible, more decision ready for policymakers. So what's next? And what we are proposing is a decision support system. So this is based on the balance sheet approach and is a process and a set of different tools that is aimed to guide all the policy, all the decision process, basically. And it can be applied to different policies. So for example, net gain, biodiversity targets, or net zero and so on, to a set of all these policies, or of course to evaluate different scenarios, and I will come to that in a minute. So how does it work? In a first balance sheet, we take a more strategic national kind of level analysis, and we can use tools such as the asset and risk register, impact assessment, outcomes, cost-benefit analysis, and so on. Here we start identifying who are the winners and losers from some policy actions. Then all this information goes into a second balance sheet where we go to the case studies, regional and local. And here we have economic valuation of ecosystem services, and we start talking about net gain from an ecological, social, and economic and financial point of view, and start understanding what are the possible compensation. Then we include other societal values, stakeholders, values, plural values, multi-criteria analysis, and so on. And eventually, we can use all this information structured this way to complement national accounts and ecosystem accounts. What we are kind of envisaging as an output of this is a DSS dashboard to summarize all this informations. And of course, this is just an idea, so it will be great if you can feed in with what it's important to find in such a dashboard. And you can see we have the different outputs, different information presented, and we can kind of ideally decide what's the impact on all of this information of a scenario. And I guess it's very important to understand what scenario is going to be important for all of us. And yeah, that's me.
Thank you, and thank you to all the speakers this afternoon. So moving in this direction, as we are across all of the projects, is taking that holistic view of the system and moving away from that kind of linear vision of biodiversity goes to function, goes to services, goes to human well-being, goes to economic return, and so on, and incorporating all those complexities. I've best said this is extremely complex space to operate in. However, we should be reassured there's lots of sophisticated techniques which we are using across the consortia that allow us to simplify those complexities, build in those intricacies, and including surprises, feedbacks, and other mechanisms that are either synergistic or antagonistic. So we can cope with those. So everything we've talked about is multivariate. We know that. So the question is how we can be helpful. In the short term, I think we can include better ways of including how X affects Y, how Y affects Z, and consider those multiple receptors. The number of receptors that we've heard about in this conference are quite limited, and they miss out some quite important ones, including functional receptors, not just presence or absence of particular phenomena or species or so on. So in the short term, we can help with that, and we can help link those all the way through to those socioeconomic outcomes, which is what we're interested in. In the longer term, and perhaps across the consortia, we can shift the view to this holistic view needed to kind of ask the kind of questions that society wants to know as we install at pace our energy requirements in our waters. So it's where we want to be, and we can help in the longer term get into that location. So we can help shape, process, and hopefully we've convinced you with these few examples in the few minutes we've had over the last couple of days, to shape the process, provide evidence, and also increase certainty rather, increase certainty. And we can underpin those models with data and importantly with case studies that span the spectrum of environmental and other factors that we need to take into account. I started by telling us that we re-emphasizing that matter of urgency. So one way you can help us is by working together. There's a lot of will in the room, and there's been a lot of will over the last couple of days, which is really nice to see, and we've learned a lot from each other, I'm sure. We need to get the right data, we need to get the right time, and we need to be proactive in doing that. There's lots of mechanisms that make it difficult to get data. And as I mentioned, we've got 2 to 3 years in this program to kind of deliver. As others have said, we've got this, everything is happening at pace. we're building our models now, we're designing our experiments now, and we're planning our field expeditions now. So over the next couple of months is when we're setting what we're going to do. So actually in the next couple of months, it would be good to interact with you, because we can modify. There's some flexibility in what we do, and if we can do that, I think we'll get to where we want to be. And many of these outcomes here, which I won't go through and read out over the next few months. So thank you very much.
Wow, thanks ever so much to all the speakers this afternoon. Can I invite, maybe not all of the people that spoke, but maybe at least Martin and Beth, and maybe if then there are questions online and in the room that need to be passed around, we can do that. So we've heard about a fantastic range of research highlights. We've taken a little bit longer than planned, but I think we needed to really get to grips with all the work that's going on in this really important area. So there's now a short opportunity for some questions online and in the room, and there'll be a lot more opportunity for discussion this afternoon. So questions, Katrine, do you want to start there?
Hi, Katrine van Landegem, Accelerate. Mike, he asked us to think about that graph that he presented and the kind of carrying capacity. And I have been thinking about it, and the baseline is indeed shifting. So what are we comparing it to? Because if you use that concept, then we would lose carrying capacity just because we're not doing it quickly, because the baseline will go down. So as you're waiting, you actually create less carrying capacity. So should the baseline not be what we predict the dire, and I suspect the dire situation of the seabed would be if we go into a scenario where we don't do anything, where we don't roll it out in an accelerated way, we have more oil and gas licenses, would that not be the baseline? What would be the state of the seabed in 2050? Let's compare it to that, maybe. That's just my thought.
Yeah, Mike, do you want to start off on the discussion of baselines?
Yeah, thanks. Right, great question. So that is indeed the question. So what is the baseline? I mean, it's not today necessarily. It's a political decision, I think, as to what the baseline is, to where we perceive what state do we want to try and engineer the system back to. So, great question. At the moment, in terms of our research, we're taking as a period in the 2010s, which predates the implementation of major offshore wind activity. But it could be anything. You choose. I mean, it's the 1980s, which was, as Francis says, the Halcyon for seabirds. I don't have an answer to that question, but it is the question.
So, where the science meets the policy decisions, I guess. There's another question just towards the back there in the middle.
Thank you to all the speakers. That was really interesting. Celestia from Ørsted. So it's a question in response to Beth's request for industry to incorporate more indicators in their monitoring. At the moment, industry sort of focus a lot of monitoring around the EIA and HRA process, and then sort of carry things on through the operational phase where required. This is not necessarily strategic, and a couple of conversations I had before about how the information we provide is data rich and information poor, perhaps. Just considering the kinds of indicators that you were requesting industry to look at, do you have a good idea about what the monitoring for that would look like, and whether it would be best taken at the sort of wind farm scale or as a sort of strategic program looking at more generic UK waters?
Okay, thank you for that. Yeah, absolutely. I would love a vision. Whoever asked, was it Zoe who asked for our vision, of actually what we do need is a strategic scale. It can't be just one development or even just a couple. It really should be at the strategic scale. And if I could jump ahead, the world I'd love to see that I think would speed everything up is that indeed we're putting out devices, we're putting out low carbon devices. So we're talking about all the lovely stuff we saw about upward faces platforms, gliders, uncrewed vessels, doing a lot of that, including then also the high def, the aerial surveys and everything, doing a lot of that, but doing it in a much more strategic way, such that we are putting these things out in a range of different habitats. So we're dealing with all kinds of the different aspects of the seabed, and that, like the other, talking about the big marine fund groups, that money in a pot, that money in a pot then that put out, and so we had the indicators from the physics through into the first trophic levels, second trophic levels. Thing is, a lot of those first, second, and third trophic levels, you know, plankton, seabird, plankton, zooplankton, and fish, a lot of those can be done with acoustics. So same instruments can measure all these things. You can also put stuff on there to measure the physics. So you can put a lot of stuff on one instrument, dot them around wind farms, dot them in between wind farms. And what happens when you get to the end of that is you then have all these drivers. You can be looking at climate change issues, you can look at wind farm issues, and what hopefully comes out of that are the ability to do our GES indicators and to do it at that strategic level. And so we've got the wind farm operators, and we've got all of the statutory groups working together. And instead of just dealing with what wind farms are doing, we're actually dealing with seeing if our oceans are in good environmental status. And if we can get to that, that's a definite win-win. And that brings us up to that strategic level. And it takes a bit of the pressure, I think, off the operators to do everything individually. And it brings the pressure back up to that strategic level. And the science community can help tremendously with that in terms of designing, because we've got the space and time to think that strategically, whereas a lot of you guys are out there firefighting at the moment with the nows. So if we could do that together, that would be fantastic.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I think there's a great opportunity, isn't there, at the moment to have a look at what we're doing in terms of monitoring and use this kind of opportunity we have with offshore wind to do things differently and get together and figure out what are the questions we need to know most urgently and how can we do that in the best way. There was a question over here, John.
Just to reiterate the thanks for those talks. It was all extremely interesting. I think it does come down to this idea of what's the baseline. And so I think the baseline is climate change and 100 gigawatts of offshore wind. So those policy decisions have already been made. So the policy is to deliver at least 50 gigawatts by 2030. We know roughly where they're going to go. And the policy decision is to deliver at least 100 gigawatts by 2050. So the baseline is not, here's the current environment without offshore wind. The baseline is, here's the current environment with 50 gigawatts by 2030 and at least 100 gigawatts by 2050. And so I think the question that this program needs to, is really focusing on is what's going to be the environmental effect of that and how do we mitigate and compensate for that effect. So a lot of the models seem to be kind of suggesting there were different alternatives or different offshore wind scenarios, but that decision's largely been made. And so I think so understanding what the baseline is, what the environmental effects of that, and then what we do to get to good environmental status is the key question.
I'll quickly start and then hand over to Mark. I would say all the groups are actually within ECOWind are looking at the counterfactual of climate change with and without wind farms. And absolutely, we are putting in all the wind farms that are at the moment scheduled. And that's what we had, someone had a comment the other day. We have to make sure we've got all the right maps because we want to have extremely comparable outputs. But absolutely, we will all do those counterfactuals. Agreed? Think about our baseline? Absolutely, but all of us will be looking at all of the wind farms and climate change. Wind farms without climate change, wind farms and climate change.
Yeah, we experimentally, we already know that climate change changes the way, for example, species work and operate, what they do. In many species actually even change their functional group, kind of from one group to another of what they do. You can almost treat them as different species. Some will come, some will go, some will increase, and all those things. So point well taken. I think the other thing around the baseline is the variability around that baseline, and when you measure that baseline. So you've got seasonal change, you've got interannual change, you've got decadal patterns. There's things that there's ebb and flow of change. And it reminds me actually, Mike Elliott gets a second mention in this conference, of an editorial he wrote about the 10 dilemmas of conservation. And one of them was, how much change do we allow? And is it within that envelope around that change? And, that envelope is changing, but also so are the constraints on the organisms and the systems in terms of how they, how much space they've got to deal with those other extra issues. And we have to accept that some species are not going to be here in the same abundances, and the way the system works is not going to be the same. So absolutely, we need to incorporate those, and hopefully we've taken care of a few of those within the design.
Great, thanks, Martin. We've got time for maybe one more super quick question. Just here, Karen.
Hi there, Karen Milliship from JNCC. It's been amazing to hear about everything that's happening today, and actually the plethora of academic and information coming through is, I wasn't expecting quite so much. That's great to hear. However, if I hear model one more time in a presentation, I think my concern and my question is the amount of information coming through is fantastic, but how as a program are you going to try and bring that together as an advisor to me and as an advisor to a regulator to give me that coherent story, or explain the differences that you're finding between your different outputs? And how can you do that periodically through the program as you're actually coming forward? And I think, just while I've got the floor, the longevity of these tools and models is also a concern. So I think as a program, we need to be thinking about that as well. Thank you.
Yeah, great question. Do you want to go quickly on that, Martin, please? Thank you.
We will. That's a very good and very pertinent question. It's something we've been thinking about a lot. And part of that is communication about what you need, when you need it, what's coming downstream. So we all operate in different circles, and it's really useful for us to know that a conversation with government is taking place in 6 months' time, or an evidence requirement is in 3 months' time, or this is our specific issue and this is how we want it. What we don't want to do, which seems to be the trend these days, is produce endless policy briefs and you kind of carrying around this baggage of things that are no use to you. One of the things we're hoping to do, separate to the science, is operate with you guys from the very outset, specific workshops that tackle specific questions and formulate both the scientific products as the evidence to back what the position is, but also the products that you need. It might be a policy brief, it might be a figure or some data, it might be one of the visualizations that you've seen on screen. So we're very aware of that, and we certainly want to work with you to do that. And we can see a few mechanisms, and we're working with engagement brokers throughout the program too, to help make those things. But as a plea to everyone, not fill our inboxes with queries and questions, and we've already spoken to a few people that have got the very specific things which actually are things we can kind of turn around in the next few weeks that would help with those processes, and we will endeavour to do that.
I just wanted to add that indeed we are doing a lot of modeling, absolutely, put up our hands, we can say that. But the point is, we're doing a lot of different modeling, but with a lot of the same input. So what happens with that is that we have a lot of output, and if it's all going in the same direction, we're incredibly certain that's what's going to happen, right? So it's set up in a way that we think, even though it looks like a complex group of very disparate models, they are using a lot of the same aspects that indeed we get that output. If everybody's saying it's going to go up or it's going to go down, then we can turn around and say, don't know the exact numbers, but it's going to go up or it's going to go down. And I think pushing that a level of certainty out there will help everybody.
Yeah.
Sorry, just to add one last very quick point as well, is one of the things we recognise is that across the programme we've got a diversity of expertise, but we haven't got all the expertise, and we actually had some meetings last night about how we can bring in external expertise for any of the questions that we need that we can expand on, and we can see a way to do that. So I don't know, Wasim, do you want to add anything?